Hey guys, so we're talking about complex numbers. So I'm using these papers to teach you complex numbers. Biggest thing that we need to know, and make sure you write everything down, pause the video. Biggest thing we need to know is that the negative square root of -1 equals I. So using that fact, there's a whole avenue of material that we're going to work through, and it's going to be great. So basically, if you start with something like square root of -25, before we would say you can't go anywhere with it. But now we're saying if you change it to square root of -1 times the square root of 25, because of this lovely fact over here, where is it? There it is. Because of that fact, we can actually expand this out and just turn it into I times square root of 25 is 5. So the square root of -25 is 5i. Okay, we're going to take it one step further. Sometimes it's not a perfect square like that one, but it's the same stuff we've been doing. So like for example, the square root of -288, you still change it so that you take out the -1 so that we can use this fact over here. But then we change the square root of 288, it's not a perfect square. But you can simplify it. What times what gives you 288, and one of them needs to be a perfect square. So you go through all the factors of 288. Maybe there's like a rainbow factor tree, you guys remember that? Where you would figure out what multiplies. Anyway, so the square root of -1 times the square root of 144 times the square root of 2 is still equivalent all the way back. And then the square root of -1, let me fix it. The square root of -1 is I, the square root of 144 is 12, and the square root of 2 is the square root of 2. So put it all together, and you have the square root of 12i times the square root of 2. And then sometimes it gets harder by, say we have -5 times -10. You have to deal with each piece at a time. So the square root of -5 is the square root of -1 times the square root of 5. And the square root of -10 is the square root of -1 times 10. And then you break down accordingly. The square root of -1 is I. The square root of -1 is I. And then the square root of 10 and the square root of 5, you just multiply to get the square root of 50. I times I is I squared. I squared, wait, if I know that I equals the square root of -1, and then I square that, that means I squared is -1. So basically use this fact to work through anything. And then you change the square root of 50. What perfect square multiplies into it? Simplify it. Well, 25 times 2, and 25 is a perfect square. So then square root of, I squared is -1, and the square root of 25 is 5. It's hard to see. And then the square root of 2 is the square root of 2. So then you multiply and you get -5 square root of 2. Right. So that's the one part. And then the next part to work on, and I'm showing you literally everything, so let me back that up to here. There. So sometimes you'll get problems like this with they look very intense, but if you look at each piece at a time, it should be just fine. The pattern that we've been working with is that using the square root of -1 rule all the way down, and then that's the pattern. It continues from there. I to the 5th power will always be I. So that's something we talked about a lot at this point. If you need more clarification, let me know. So for this one part where we have 2i to the 5th power, that turns into 2 to the 5th times I to the 5th. And then over here, I to the 2nd power is I squared. And then square root of 6 squared is the square root of 6 squared. Do you see the colors, how I change that each piece at a time? Then 2 to the 5th. 2 to the 5th is 32. Oh, you can't see it when I move it like that. 2 to the 5th is 32. I to the 5th is I to the 5th. I squared is I squared. And then what happens here is the square root of 6 squared just cancels to 6. So then we multiply 32 times 6 is 192. I to the 5th times I to the 2nd is I to the 7th. It's how many i's do we have? And then the I to the 7th, you just have to use your pattern. Okay, so how does that simplify? You divide 7 by 4. Let's use long division. And you get a remainder of 3. So basically, because it's 7, you're going to have I to the 4th, that's 1, times I to the 3rd, that's negative I. So 192 times negative I is negative 192I. Okay? And then the last thing that we have to do, which we've had some experience with, is solve. So this is nothing new. You've been solving quadratic equations. So you add 3 to both sides, and you get negative 4x squared equals 484. Divide by negative 4. Divide by negative 4, and you get x squared equals negative 121. The opposite of a square is a square root, so you square root both sides, but make sure you don't forget about that plus or minus, wherever that is. And then, hey, we got to break it down just like we've already done, right? So you look at square root of negative 1 times square root of 121, and then you look at square root of negative 1 is 1i, and square root of 121 is 11. Put it in the right order, and x equals positive or negative, just circling it, positive or negative 11i. All right, that's what we've learned so far. Awesome.